Ro, I cannot let you go, and I cannot get any further in this conversation without just really scratching some of my curiosity about how some of this works. I'm sure that there are not people in every church in America twirling their mustache thinking about how they can like manipulate and brainwash and deceive their congregation. And yet we recognize that, some of these like altar calls, some of the usage of music and praying in tongues and dancing and all of these things can have sort of a manipulative component. What elements can you really tell us about, or what can you tell us that you've seen from behind the curtain?
Actually, I'd be in front of the curtain, but that's just
Yeah, sure, fair to say.
but that's just
Formalities.
yeah, it's just me just being, Um you mentioned earlier, you mentioned the word dysresonance, which I hope you didn't mind me correcting you on. My music
I mean, it
educator
was.
brain
Oh, no!
kicked
Please,
in.
I appreciate
And
it, but I also I like to invent words when I want to highlight like a specific notion. So I
yes,
just appreciate the indulgence and the fact that the ACA lets me do this shit every
yeah,
week.
yeah. This is your show. I don't want to step on any toes. I was in that music. Since we're in talking about so much music, I was
Yeah.
in a musical terminology type of mode. But dissonance is, let's say, the use of resonance and dissonance, or I should say, the use of harmony and dissonance, because really the opposite of harmony is dissonance,
Hmm.
not resonance. Um, that's also me just being super music geeky. um, the use of that is a um, really valuable tool in the space of playing for these churches. Uh, and I would say that, when you're playing for a Pentecostal or a Protestant church in general, but especially something that's on the evangelical side, Pentecostal, Baptist, any type of service where there's a lot of improvisation that's being used,
Hmm.
in terms of song form, in terms of song selection, uh, those tools really kind of guide the service. And there's two things I would say. As a musician, one of the things that you learn, especially in a Black church, is that, and music in general is super super wedded to the direction of service and whoever's leading the service, the pastor, the priest, and so forth. But especially in a Black church, in a Baptist sort of, like I said, evangelical improvisational type of service, music is right under the pastor. Like, the minister of music is, and basically the second person underneath the pastor. Now, technically, they have other ministers, lay ministers and so forth, and people who technically outrank the minister of music, but everybody knows that the minister of music works and the pastor work in tandem. And sometimes it's the minister of music calling the shots. Sometimes it's the pastor calling the shots. Sometimes it's mutual. But there's a relationship there. And the more you learn your pastor, the more you learn the type of congregation you have and the type of people who are in that congregation. Um, and also, the more you learn your own musicians and your own choir, if you have that as auxiliary help, the more tools you have in your toolbox to really guide the service in a way where the pastor can be pleased, and you can keep your job. And all of those things are. I'm sorry. That's let me. I don't know if you're hearing that. Let me make sure that you're not hearing that. Um, the the whole direction of worship falls under a certain umbrella where certain chords are used, certain songs are used, certain tones are used. Especially if you're playing the organ, there's certain stops that you pull out if it's a Hammond, and even if it's a pipe organ, which is a different type of organ, but you still have the same general dynamics where there's certain stops that you use. And stops, for those of you who aren't musicians, are the actual sort of the terms for the the instrumentation or the selections of instrumentation that an organ can produce. And you may have flute, you may have brass sounds, you may have organ, you may have an 8-foot pipe, you may have a 16-foot pipe, and so forth. All of those things are called stops. And when you're playing organ, if you see an organist pulling those things out, what they're doing is they're pulling out stops. And I just had to tell someone yesterday, one of my students, I was telling him where that phrase comes from, pulling out the stops. Because a lot
Yeah,
of
that's the
times,
second time you've blown my mind already tonight.
I
So
was
yeah,
thank you for that.
yeah, that's where it
Yeah.
comes from. Like, and so when you are, especially if you're playing a pipe organ and you're playing this grand piece and you've got 3 or 4 consoles and it's, let's say 5 verses of, how great thou art, and you get to that last verse, it's like boom, boom, and you got the pedal tone.
That
You
makes
pull
so
out,
much more sense.
yes, you pull out all the stops for all of the grandeur of the song to just, and that also is a part of, like I said, or what you're saying, Christy, is that's a part of the sausage making of these feelings that we all have in service. It's very uh non-spiritual, shall I say. We call it spiritual, and people who are in the
It's a
services,
science. It's
but
musical science.
it's a musical science, and that's what you do. It's like, you're flying a plane. As you approach the airport, you start to do certain things. You start to lower the flaps, lower the landing gear. You reduce this. There's certain things that you just do. And when you're a musician and you're playing in these churches and you're an organist, not just an organist, but in this case, there's certain things that you do to create a certain feeling. And just going back to my student yesterday, there's one song that he's playing. He plays classical and jazz and so forth. But one of the songs that I'm giving him is what is the song? Great is thy faithfulness, right? You know that song, like da, 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 right? That's a song that congregations love. And one of the things that I'm trying to teach him is that because he's going to end up playing in church, most piano players end up playing in church at some point. He's also someone who's very much in church, and I want to teach him how to play these songs. And one of the things that I'm telling him is that this is a song that has 3 verses. Sometimes there may be 4, but it's most of the time it's 3 verses. And if you can play Great is Thy Faithfulness and play it very well, very masterfully, and know how to create rise and fall in the verses and in different passages of the song, and build your arc dynamically with the voicings that you choose, the stops, if you're playing organ, and if you're playing piano, with the sort of the elaboration of your arrangement, and sort of deviating from the written music to starting to use more pedal tones and more bass and double bass and kind of glissandos and all kinds of crescendos and things. If you can learn how to do that and where to do that between verse 1, verse 2, verse 3, you can create the magic of Great is Thy Faithfulness that congregations love. And congregations love Great is Thy Faithfulness. It's a song that's very dear to a believer's experience. And one of the things that I had to learn at some point in my playing, especially when I wasn't a believer, especially after I had known that, okay, I don't believe this, I had to accept the fact that I can't walk into that space with full judgment on as a musician. Although it's in the back of my head, right? There are things that I do judge, right? But when I'm in the space of being the musician, I am providing a service, right? I am providing a service to worshipers, to people who have come to worship and who have an experience. Now, what we call spirit or spirituality, we don't particularly give that, credence, right? Like, we don't say those words. But what they call spirituality is the experience of worship and all of the feelings, all of the goosebumps, all of the tears, and all of the rapture of these songs, especially when it comes time for them to be played. The idea of what I'm doing there is to give them that experience. I know how to do that.
That was actually what I was going to ask you. How is it being a non-believer and crafting, which sounds like I kind of want to go now. What is such an expertly crafted experience, knowing that these people are going to feel the things that you want them to feel because you are a master of your craft. How do you massage? Oh, Christy, make me sound smart.
How do I?
Occasion the divine, or just create the phenomenology is maybe the word that I'm going to use here in place of spiritual, because you can generate these things that feel like magic.
Yeah,
it's like being a cook. My sister is a vegetarian. She's been a vegetarian for a long time, but she cooks a very good fried chicken. And I don't really eat fried chicken, but when she cooks it, I eat it. And she cooks it for, she has this chicken called Obama chicken, and it's a hit basically in the family and in the neighborhood. And shout out to my sister, Cassandra. I know she probably won't like me saying that. But the reason I bring that up is because she knows what people like. She knows the flavors. She knows the sort of palates that people have. And she cooks according to that. And she can do that even being a vegetarian, right? She doesn't eat meat. She hasn't eaten meat for 15 some years, maybe 20. And so being a non-believer, I'm still able to connect with the people in a service. I'm able to connect with the music. I'm able to enjoy playing the music and sort of, and I, even if I don't necessarily want to play it, like, once again, I'm an artist. I can create and I can recreate. And so in a space where I'm playing for a congregation, I know what people want. And especially having done it as long as I've done it, I know what people want, like I know what they want.
There was a question on YouTube, Pinball Boy 87. Pinball Boy 87.
Okay.
Right? I love that name. Anyone think they could be using music to create the atmosphere that creates emotional connection, which we did touch on, but then he goes further with something I thought was interesting. He says he knows legit churches where they have unsaved people play in the band and see it as a ministry. And as someone who plays violin and played, I don't ask me to do it now.
Played.
And not very well back then.
Well, I couldn't possibly. I'm not prepared.
I'm not prepared.
The amp is turned on in the back. And,
Oh, don't make me sing.
You guys know me too well. But yeah, like I actually could see that happening where they'd be like, oh yeah, like you don't have to believe, just go. And then again, there is something magical and synergistic when you're playing with other people and having to get in rhythm with them. Do you think that is
they're also vibing?
Yeah, the vibe.
I mean, my dad was so judgmental about that kind of thing. Like, and he would walk into a church that he had already made up his mind was not like a true believer of God, because conspiracy theories just tend to pile up once you get into one of them. And he would just kind of like walk in, listen for 30 seconds, and be like, nah, the Spirit of the Lord's not moving here. And it would be like he would always believe it'd be because the musicians themselves weren't believing what they were playing.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that, because that was one of those things I wanted to circle back to. There is a part of with these types of churches, the very charismatic and evangelical churches. There are churches that do have room for those kinds of critiques, and that's also coercive. It's a pressure that they put on the congregation and the musicians to essentially conform and to create anxiety around devotion and to make people feel as if, and this is one of the techniques that religion is good at, which is making you feel like there's always that next level, right? I don't care how spiritual you may be, there's always another level.
I was about to say, you could always be working closer and closer to going clear. There's always like another Thetan, another demon, another, in the closet, some unconfessed sin.
Yeah.
Didn't they make it to where you climb up the ladder, then you fall back down, you have to go back up? Like,
oh gosh.
I think like once you go clear, there's like double clear. I'm not kidding. I'm not kidding.
But
our levels are over 3,000.
But it's so true, because it doesn't matter what religion it is. It's always that dynamic of not, of basically creating an anxiety and a disapproving sort of tone to how people practice that supposedly can make them work harder to be more, to give more, to be more, to do more.
Mhm.
And you know some churches do it better than others, some churches do it more acutely than others, but a lot of these churches have that. And I've been in those churches where the pastor will say a thing, or will, there's also this notion of I think the Satan, or it's either Satan or the devil, some devil was the first musician, or the first musician was the devil, or the first musician was Satan, or something like that. It's sort of like uh, some scriptural component, I guess,
The devil went
somewhere.
down to Georgia.
Right. And so, sometimes I've been in churches where, when the pastors get on that tangent, or if it's someone else, maybe an evangelist or somebody, that will come up. And when they, normally when you're playing in a service, you're kind of exempt from so much that's happening in the pulpit.
Sure.
The message is going from the pulpit out. You're there to facilitate the service.
Nobody needs to preach to the choir.
Right. Yeah. But like I said, in these moments when the church or the pastor wants to sort of put that pressure of going higher in Christ and so forth, that eye of Sauron will sometimes turn over to the choir box and the area where the musician is, and they will be on the spot for a moment because they will use a scripture like that. The first musician was a devil, or Satan himself. I've been told that the first musician was. People have told me that.
I mean, you often see Lucifer depicted playing the lyre, or whatever else.
That's what it is, Lucifer.
Doesn't Baphomet usually also have like something to?
Yeah,
like,
I mean, it's I wouldn't be surprised if there's some sort of tie-in with Dionysus or something in there, because it sort of falls under that whole pleasure and sort of
everything
almost
was begged, borrowed, and stolen at some point or another.
Yeah, and so playing the lute and drinking and all that kind of stuff, they're all together. And it's also one of the things that's used as an excuse or an apology for why so many musicians in certain churches are so whorish, because there's another sort of channel where people understand that Lucifer was the first musician, and that these things are associated with drinking and hedonism and so forth. And so people will know this is another thing of performance and expectation and performance, gender performance, for straight people, where you can be in these churches and the whole church has to be holy and living in holiness and righteousness, but the musicians are whores, quote unquote.
Yeah.
And it's all right, because people expect that of the musicians, especially the drummers and the bass players, and especially if they're straight. And so there's this weird sort of confluence of all of these weird sort of expectations, and this sort of sex negativity, and these sort of acceptances of promiscuity that go to reinforce a toxic masculinity. That
Not to mention just the group cohesion. Like we haven't even talked about denominations that don't allow for dancing, or don't allow for instrumentation, or I mean, you can tell a lot about a church and the culture and the community by the type of music they listen to, and in group and out group. I mean, there is so much to dive in here. But I do have a pair of phone calls that I want to make sure to answer before we wrap up for the night. But before I pull those up, were there any last thoughts here?
Oh,
yeah. No, there's a lot to dive into. I just wanted to make sure to give you a chance to finish your thoughts since I jumped in.
The only thought that I mean, because there's so much to talk about. This is a rich subject, as I think we talked about. But I do want to just circle back to one of the things that I was explaining earlier about the musician B. Slade, who I was talking about as the formerly known artist formerly known as Tone. Good case study if anybody, particularly in the space of Black religious music, Black contemporary gospel music, is looking to sort of just kind of peek in and see what's happening. Tone is a great case study in the dynamics of religiosity and sexuality, gender performance, homophobia, and the what's been known as the church or Christian industrial complex, and specifically the gospel music industrial complex, because he came out and was essentially disfellowshipped and lost all of his gigs, all opportunities, all the scheduling fell out. He was and he was actually really speaking in a moment of candor, because he was interviewed by someone named oh God, I forgot the lady's name. She starts with an S, but it was an interview that he gave after many years of being flamboyant. And the interviewer asked him point blank, "Are you gay, or do you have feelings for men?" And he actually came clean, and he really just honestly spoke and said yes. And that created a whole cascade of negative press and condemnation and controversy for him. And then he ended up becoming an R&B and soul singer, putting out some amazing music and doing a lot of what Lil Nas is doing today. He was doing as a former gospel artist, and he's still performing and just doing great music. But it's a sad story that does have some good good aspects to it, but it's very unfortunate that to this day he's still on the outside of the community that he grew up in and that he knew, and that had rewarded him so much.
Well, I'll be sure to have some links to his story and a lot of the music that we've been talking about in the notes for this episode.